I told you to put that phone down.
I'm on my own property, man. I'm not doing anything.
You think you're gonna film me? Turn around.
Hey, I have a permit.
Blackwell.
I have a permit. Stop.
Hey, let him go. That's enough. Let him go.
I'm checking for weapons.
Step back now.
I'm licensed, man.
We're gonna sort this out. Back up.
It was a Wednesday evening in the small town of Ashford, nestled in the rural stretches of eastern Idaho, when Marcus Holloway found himself at the center of an encounter that would challenge everything he believed about constitutional rights, police accountability, and the delicate balance between authority and freedom. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the distant mountain ridges, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of this community where everyone knew their neighbors and strangers were noticed within minutes of their arrival. The air carried that particular crispness that comes with late autumn in Idaho, and the leaves that still clung to the trees had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Marcus was 34 years old, a mechanic by trade who had spent the better part of 12 years working at the same automotive repair shop on the edge of town. His hands were perpetually stained with traces of motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove, and he wore that evidence of honest labor with quiet pride. He was the kind of man who believed in doing things right, in following rules, and in the fundamental promise that the Constitution made to every American citizen. He paid his taxes on time, waved to his neighbors, and had never been in serious trouble with the law. On this particular evening, he had just left Henderson's Hardware after picking up a new set of brake pads and some electrical tape for a project he was working on at home. As Marcus pulled his older model pickup truck up to the intersection of Main Street and Cedar Avenue, he noticed the distinctive markings of a state highway patrol vehicle in the lane beside him. The cruiser was sleek and imposing, its emergency light bar dark but still projecting an aura of authority that caused most citizens to instinctively check their speedometers. Behind the wheel sat Trooper Nathan Blackwell of the Idaho Highway Patrol, a man whose face Marcus didn't recognize but whose uniform commanded a certain automatic respect. The traffic light glowed red against the darkening sky, and both vehicles waited in that peculiar silence that exists between strangers at an intersection. Marcus glanced at his dashboard clock, noting that it was just after 6 in the evening. He had worked the next morning at 7 sharp, and his mind was already turning toward the simple dinner he would prepare and the few hours of television he might catch before bed. Life in Ashford moved at a predictable pace, and Marcus had grown comfortable with that rhythm. When the light changed to green, Marcus pressed the accelerator with the measured patience of a man who knew this road intimately. The speed limit along this stretch was clearly posted at 20 miles per hour, a restriction that existed because of the elementary school located 2 blocks down and the senior center that sat on the corner. Marcus brought his truck up to exactly 20 miles per hour, a speed he maintained out of habit and respect for the community where he had spent his entire adult life. But something caught his attention in his peripheral vision. The patrol cruiser beside him was pulling away, accelerating past Marcus with a casual disregard for the posted limit. It wasn't excessive, perhaps 30 or 32 in a 20 zone, but it was enough to make Marcus raise an eyebrow. He watched as the cruiser moved ahead, its taillights growing smaller in the distance. A small voice in his head noted the irony, but he dismissed it. Police officers sometimes had places to be, and who was he to judge? The next intersection brought them together again. Cedar Avenue met Highway Junction Road, and this time there was a right turn on red situation that any driver in America would recognize. Marcus pulled into the straight lane while the patrol cruiser positioned itself in the right turn lane. From his vantage point, Marcus had a clear view of what happened next. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that we focus on these encounters between citizens and law enforcement. Not because we have any animosity toward police officers, but because these moments reveal something profound about the nature of power and accountability in our society. The story you are about to hear is one of those moments, and I encourage you to stay until the very end because what unfolds will challenge your assumptions and perhaps make you think differently about your own rights. The patrol cruiser began its right turn without coming to a complete stop. It was what traffic enforcement officers across the country routinely describe as a rolling stop, the kind of minor violation that has resulted in countless citations for ordinary citizens. Marcus watched as the vehicle swept through the turn, barely slowing, certainly not achieving that full cessation of movement that the law requires before proceeding through a red light. His dash cam, a device he had installed 3 years earlier after a near-miss accident that the other driver had tried to blame on him, captured the entire sequence with its characteristic wide-angle clarity. Now, Marcus was not a confrontational person by nature. He was not someone who went looking for trouble or who harbored deep suspicions about law enforcement, but he had grown up with a father who served 2 tours in Vietnam and who had instilled in him a fundamental belief in fairness and equal treatment under the law. The double standard bothered him, not in an aggressive way, but in that quiet, persistent manner that sits in your chest and refuses to be ignored. He continued driving, following the patrol cruiser at a respectful distance as both vehicles navigated the familiar streets of downtown Ashford. When they reached the intersection near the old post office, Marcus watched as the cruiser made another turn, this time cutting through an alley that served as a back entrance to the Ashford Police Department parking area. The issue was that the trooper entered from the wrong direction, passing directly under a sign that clearly displayed the words "Do Not Enter" alongside the universal red circle with the white horizontal bar. This was the moment when Marcus made a decision that would alter the course of his evening in ways he could never have anticipated. He pulled his truck around the corner, finding a spot along the back edge of the police department parking lot. This was a public area frequented by citizens who needed to access the building for various municipal services. There was nothing restricted or private about where Marcus positioned his vehicle. He sat for a moment, his engine idling, considering what he wanted to do. The rational part of his mind suggested that these were minor infractions, the kind of thing that happened every day and rarely resulted in any consequences. 99 times out of 100, he would have simply driven home and forgotten about the entire sequence of events. But something about this evening felt different. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small hypocrisies he had witnessed over the years. Or perhaps it was simply that his dashcam had captured clear evidence of what he had seen. Marcus turned off his engine and stepped out of his truck. The evening air was cool against his skin, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. He pulled his phone from his pocket and walked toward the patrol cruiser, which sat idling in the lot, its driver apparently attending to something inside the vehicle. His intention was simple: to take a photograph of the cruiser that would allow him to identify the specific unit number, and by extension, the officer responsible for the violations he had witnessed. He raised his phone and captured his first image, a straightforward shot of the vehicle from about 15 feet away. The cruiser's markings were clearly visible, along with the unit number painted on the rear quarter panel. Marcus took a second photograph, this one from a slightly different angle that showed the cruiser's position relative to the "Do Not Enter" sign that the trooper had disregarded. He was preparing to return to his truck when the cruiser's door opened with sudden force, and Trooper Nathan Blackwell emerged with an expression that Marcus could only describe as aggressive irritation. The trooper was perhaps in his late 30s with a military-style haircut and the kind of rigid posture that suggested he viewed every interaction as a potential confrontation. His hand moved instinctively toward his duty belt as he fixed Marcus with a stare that carried unmistakable hostility. What happened in the next several seconds would set the tone for everything that followed. The trooper's voice cut through the quiet evening air with sharp authority, demanding to know what Marcus was doing. There was no greeting, no attempt at professional courtesy, just an immediate assertion of dominance that caught Marcus off guard. Marcus, trying to maintain his composure despite the sudden confrontation, explained that he was taking photographs. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a man who had done nothing wrong and had no reason to believe he was in any kind of trouble. He mentioned the traffic violations, the speeding, the rolling stop, the disregard for the clearly posted traffic sign. He explained that he was simply documenting what he had witnessed for the purpose of potentially filing a complaint. The trooper's reaction to this explanation was not what Marcus expected. Rather than acknowledging the complaint or directing Marcus to the proper channels for such concerns, Trooper Blackwell fixated on a different aspect of what had occurred. He took issue with the photographs themselves, specifically with the fact that one of the images had been taken through the window of his patrol vehicle, capturing a partial view of the interior. This detail would become central to everything that followed, and it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a willful disregard, of how privacy laws actually work in the United States. The trooper seemed to believe that because it was his official vehicle, because it contained his official equipment, that somehow it existed in a bubble of privacy that ordinary citizens were forbidden to penetrate, even with something as benign as a camera lens from a public space. Let me take a moment here to address something that I think many of you in the audience might be wondering about. If you have ever found yourself in a situation where you question whether you had the right to photograph or record police officers or their vehicles, you are not alone. This is one of the most commonly misunderstood areas of constitutional law, and the confusion is often exploited by officers who would prefer that citizens not document their activities. The truth is that courts across this country have repeatedly affirmed the right of citizens to photograph and record law enforcement officers, their vehicles, and their activities when those activities occur in public spaces. This right is grounded in the First Amendment's protection of free speech and the related concept of government accountability. When a police officer is on duty, when their vehicle is parked in a public area, when their actions are visible to anyone who might walk by, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy that shields them from documentation. This becomes particularly relevant when we consider what the trooper was about to do, which was to detain Marcus based on nothing more than the act of taking those photographs. In legal terms, there are 3 types of encounters that can occur between a police officer and a citizen. The first is a consensual encounter, where both parties are free to walk away at any time, and the citizen has no obligation to answer questions or provide identification. The second is what lawyers call a Terry stop, named after a landmark Supreme Court case, which is an investigatory detention where the citizen is not free to leave, but where the officer must possess something called reasonable suspicion. The third is a full arrest, which requires probable cause to believe that the citizen has committed a crime. What Trooper Blackwell did next removed any possibility that this was a consensual encounter. He positioned himself directly in front of Marcus, physically blocking his path whenever Marcus made even the slightest movement toward his truck. His body language communicated unmistakably that Marcus was not permitted to leave, that he was being held in place by the authority of the badge and the implicit threat of what might happen if he tried to walk away. The trooper's demands escalated rapidly. He wanted identification. He wanted Marcus to prove who he was, to submit to having his background checked, to demonstrate that he had no outstanding warrants that might justify an arrest. The reasoning he offered for this demand was startling in its transparency. He told Marcus that he needed to verify that he was not a terrorist, that if there was any warrant out for his arrest, he would be taken to jail immediately. Think about that for a moment. Consider what was actually being said. A citizen stands in a public parking lot exercising his constitutional right to photograph a government vehicle, and an agent of the state responds by raising the specter of terrorism and hoping aloud that there might be some legal justification to place that citizen behind bars. The adversarial nature of this interaction was not subtle. It was not disguised behind professional courtesy or procedural necessity. It was naked retaliation against someone who had dared to document and potentially criticize a police officer's behavior. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He was a working man with responsibilities, a job that required him to show up at 7 the next morning, a life that could not afford the disruption of an arrest, even an illegitimate one. He understood, with the clarity that comes from being on the wrong side of power, that asserting his rights in that moment might result in consequences that would follow him for months or even years. An arrest record, even for charges that are later dismissed, can affect employment, housing, and countless other aspects of a person's life. So he handed over his identification, not because he believed the trooper had any legal right to demand it, not because he thought he had done anything wrong, but because the calculus of risk and reward in that moment pointed toward compliance as the path of least harm. This is a decision that countless Americans face when confronted with unlawful police conduct, and it is a decision that deserves our understanding rather than our judgment. What many people do not realize is that for a detention like this to be lawful, the officer must possess what the law calls reasonable articulable suspicion. This is a legal standard that requires specific, objective facts suggesting that criminal activity is afoot. It is not enough for an officer to have a hunch or a feeling. It is not enough for an officer to find a citizen's behavior unusual or annoying. There must be concrete facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that a crime has been committed or is about to be committed. What facts did Trooper Blackwell have? He had observed Marcus take photographs of his patrol vehicle in a public parking lot. That was the entirety of the suspicious conduct. And here is the critical point that cannot be emphasized enough. Taking photographs of police vehicles and police officers in public spaces is not a crime. It is, in fact, constitutionally protected activity. Courts have recognized that the right to document government officials and their operations is fundamental to the functioning of a free society. If you are finding this breakdown helpful, I want to encourage you to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what we have discussed so far. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt your rights were being violated by someone in authority? How did you handle it? These conversations matter because they help all of us understand the landscape of rights and responsibilities that define our interactions with the government. While the trooper waited for dispatch to respond with information about Marcus's background, his attention wandered to the other vehicles in the parking lot. He asked Marcus which vehicle was his, pointing toward a white cargo van that sat several spaces away. When Marcus declined to answer, exercising his right to remain silent, the trooper's response dripped with condescension. He made a comment about Marcus suddenly not wanting to answer questions, as if the invocation of a constitutional right was somehow evidence of guilt or evasion. The trooper walked toward the white van, apparently intending to run its plates in search of additional grounds for arrest or citation. What he did not know, and what Marcus did not bother to clarify, was that the van did not belong to Marcus. It was simply a vehicle that happened to be parked in the same public lot. The trooper's willingness to run those plates, to dig through databases searching for any possible violation or outstanding warrant, revealed the true nature of what was happening. This was not a legitimate law enforcement encounter aimed at public safety. This was a fishing expedition, an attempt to find any possible justification for punishing someone who had the audacity to document police misconduct. It was during this interlude that something remarkable occurred. Another officer emerged from the Ashford Police Department building, apparently curious about the commotion occurring in the back parking lot. This officer, Sergeant William Carver of the local police department, approached the scene with a demeanor that stood in stark contrast to Trooper Blackwell's aggression. Sergeant Carver asked what was going on, and when Marcus explained that he was being detained for taking a photograph, the sergeant's response was notable for its immediate recognition of constitutional principles. He observed, almost casually, that photography was protected by the First Amendment, even when it involved looking through windows. This was not a declaration of support for Marcus, nor was it an attempt to intervene in another agency's business. It was simply a statement of fact from an officer who apparently understood the legal landscape better than the trooper who was conducting the detention. What happened next represents one of the most significant elements of this entire encounter. Sergeant Carver recognized that what he was witnessing might constitute misconduct by a fellow law enforcement officer. Rather than look the other way, rather than extend the professional courtesy that too often shields bad actors from accountability, he made a decision that would prove crucial. He activated his body-worn camera. This single act, the decision to document what was happening, transformed the encounter from a case of one person's word against another into a matter of recorded fact. Sergeant Carver's body camera would capture everything that followed, providing evidence that no internal affairs investigation could dismiss or explain away. Think about what this tells us about the importance of documentation in encounters with police. If Marcus had not had his dashcam rolling during the traffic violations, there would be no evidence of the speeding, the rolling stop, the disregard for the traffic sign. If Sergeant Carver had not activated his body camera, there would be no independent verification of how Trooper Blackwell conducted himself during this detention. We live in an age where technology has given ordinary citizens the ability to document their interactions with authority in ways that were unimaginable just a generation ago. That technology has become one of the most powerful tools for accountability that exists. It is why so many of the cases we discuss on this channel involve video evidence, and it is why you should always, within the bounds of the law, document your encounters with police whenever possible. Trooper Blackwell returned from his unsuccessful search for Marcus's vehicle, still waiting on dispatch to provide whatever information might be available about Marcus's background. A conversation developed between Marcus and Sergeant Carver that revealed something important about the different approaches that law enforcement officers can take to constitutional rights. The sergeant mentioned that he had seen Marcus around town before, often carrying a firearm openly, as was his legal right under Idaho law. Rather than viewing this as a threat or a provocation, Sergeant Carver expressed his respect for Marcus's Second Amendment rights. He noted that he simply left Marcus alone during those encounters because carrying a firearm was not illegal. Here was an officer who understood that constitutional rights are not suspicious activities, that exercising them does not transform a citizen into a threat. Marcus responded with a statement that captured the essence of his frustration. He said that he appreciated the respect for his Second Amendment rights, but he wished that officers would show the same respect for the First Amendment. This observation cut to the heart of the inconsistency that too many citizens experience. Some rights are celebrated and defended by law enforcement, while others, particularly those that involve documenting or criticizing police conduct, are treated as threats to be suppressed. Sergeant Carver was careful not to comment directly on what Trooper Blackwell was doing. He explained that the state police operated above his level in the law enforcement hierarchy, and he did not want to interfere with their business. But his actions spoke louder than any commentary. By keeping his body camera rolling, by offering to create an incident report that Marcus could access later, by simply being a witness to what was occurring, he was providing a form of accountability that would prove invaluable. The dispatch finally returned with information about Marcus. The results were exactly what anyone who knew Marcus would have predicted. No criminal history of relevance, no outstanding warrants, no evidence whatsoever that he posed any kind of threat to anyone. By every objective measure, Marcus was exactly what he appeared to be. An ordinary citizen who had done nothing more than document traffic violations committed by a state trooper. But the trooper was not finished. The background check had revealed one piece of information that Trooper Blackwell apparently viewed as an opportunity for further harassment. Marcus had a concealed carry permit on file. This was not unusual in Idaho, a state with strong traditions of gun ownership and concealed carry rights. But for Trooper Blackwell, who had been unable to find any legitimate basis for arresting or citing Marcus, the concealed carry permit offered one final avenue for escalation. The trooper approached Marcus and asked whether he was currently carrying a concealed weapon. Marcus, consistent with his approach throughout the encounter, declined to answer the question. He was exercising his right to remain silent, a right that exists precisely because citizens should not be compelled to provide information that might be used against them. What happened next was physical. Trooper Blackwell seized Marcus's arms and forced them behind his back. He held Marcus's wrists together while conducting a pat-down search of his entire body. The frisk was thorough, perhaps excessively so, with the trooper's hands moving across Marcus's body in ways that seemed designed to humiliate as much as to search. This type of search, known legally as a Terry frisk, is only permitted under specific circumstances. An officer conducting a Terry stop may perform a limited pat-down search for weapons, but only if the officer has reasonable belief that the person stopped is armed and presently dangerous. The mere existence of a concealed carry permit does not satisfy this standard. Millions of Americans have concealed carry permits and go about their daily lives without posing any threat to anyone. A permit is not the same as actually carrying a weapon, and even carrying a weapon is not the same as being dangerous. There was nothing in Marcus's behavior that suggested danger. He had been standing calmly in a public parking lot, answering some questions and declining to answer others, exercising his constitutional rights in a manner that was entirely peaceful. The only threat he posed was to Trooper Blackwell's pride, and that is not a legally recognized basis for a weapons search. The search turned up nothing. Marcus was not carrying a weapon that evening, a fact that the trooper could have simply asked about and accepted had his goal been actual safety rather than harassment. But the absence of contraband or weapons did not result in an apology or any acknowledgement that the situation had been handled improperly. Instead, Trooper Blackwell concluded the encounter in a manner that captured the contempt he apparently felt for this citizen who had dared to document his behavior. Rather than handing Marcus's identification back to him directly, the trooper grabbed it and shoved it into one of Marcus's pockets without telling him what he was doing. He then turned and walked away, barking over his shoulder that Marcus should leave. The dismissal was rude, abrupt, and utterly lacking in any of the professionalism that citizens have a right to expect from public servants. Marcus, momentarily confused about what had happened to his ID, asked where it was. The trooper's response was curt. It was in his pocket. That was the extent of the explanation he was willing to provide. Sergeant Carver, who had witnessed all of this, offered a more human conclusion to the encounter. He confirmed that he would create an incident report and that Marcus would be able to access it by coming to the station. He acknowledged that Marcus might want documentation in case anything further developed from this situation. The contrast between these two officers, one who had violated rights and the other who had documented those violations, could not have been more stark. I want to pause here and ask you directly, what would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have simply walked away after witnessing the traffic violations? Would you have taken photographs? Would you have handed over your identification or refused? Would you have filed a complaint? There are no wrong answers to these questions because each person must make their own decisions about when and how to assert their rights. But I think it is worth reflecting on the choices that Marcus made and what they tell us about the practical challenges of exercising constitutional rights in real-world encounters with authority. The days following the encounter brought Marcus to a crossroads. He had done nothing wrong. He had exercised his First Amendment right to document police activity and had been detained, harassed, searched, and insulted as a result. The question was whether he would let the matter drop or whether he would pursue accountability through official channels. For some people, the answer would be obvious. The encounter was over, no permanent harm had been done, and pursuing a complaint would only invite further attention from law enforcement. There is a practical wisdom in this approach that should not be dismissed. People who make complaints against police officers sometimes find themselves subjected to heightened scrutiny, more frequent traffic stops, and an overall increase in uncomfortable interactions with the system. But Marcus was not built to let things go. Perhaps it was the influence of his father, who had taught him that citizenship carries responsibilities as well as rights. Perhaps it was simply his nature, his belief that if nobody ever complained about misconduct, then misconduct would continue unchecked. Whatever the motivation, he decided to file a formal complaint with the Idaho Highway Patrol. The process of filing a complaint against a police officer is something that many people never experience and few understand. There are forms to fill out, descriptions to provide, timelines to establish. You are asking an institution to investigate one of its own members, which creates inherent conflicts of interest that can be difficult to overcome. The person reviewing your complaint may be a colleague of the officer you are accusing, someone who eats lunch with them, shares jokes with them, relies on them for backup in dangerous situations. Marcus filled out the paperwork with careful attention to detail. He described what he had witnessed in terms of the traffic violations, the speeding, the rolling stop, the disregard for the traffic sign. He described the detention that followed, the demands for identification, the threats of arrest, the search. He noted that he had dash cam footage of the traffic violations and that Sergeant Carver's body camera had captured the detention itself. The complaint was submitted to Trooper Blackwell's supervisor, a woman whose name Marcus would come to know well over the following weeks. She contacted him multiple times to clarify aspects of his statement, to ask follow-up questions, to ensure that she understood exactly what he was alleging. These conversations were professional enough, but they also had the feel of an institution going through motions, checking boxes, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate that the complaint had been properly processed, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Weeks passed without any resolution. The supervisor did not provide updates on the status of the investigation. Marcus was left to wonder whether his complaint had been taken seriously, whether any corrective action had been taken, whether Trooper Blackwell had faced any consequences whatsoever for his conduct. This ambiguity is one of the most frustrating aspects of the complaint process for citizens. You pour your time and energy into documenting what happened and seeking accountability, and then you are left in darkness, waiting for decisions that may never be communicated to you. As of the time this story came to public attention, Marcus had not received any definitive response regarding the outcome of his complaint. The wheels of internal affairs investigations turn slowly, and they often turn in directions that protect officers rather than holding them accountable. This is not cynicism, but simply a reflection of the statistical reality. The vast majority of citizen complaints against police officers are not sustained, meaning that the investigating body concludes either that the misconduct did not occur or that it cannot be proven to have occurred. But here is what makes this case different and why it is so important to tell this story. There is video evidence. The dash cam footage shows the traffic violations. Sergeant Carver's body camera shows the detention, the threats, the search, the dismissive conclusion. Whatever the internal affairs investigation concludes, the public now has the ability to see what happened and to make their own judgments about whether it was appropriate. Let me take a few moments to discuss the legal principles at stake in this encounter, because understanding these principles is essential to recognizing why what happened to Marcus was wrong. The foundational legal standard for investigatory detentions comes from a 1968 Supreme Court case called Terry v. Ohio. In that case, the court held that police officers may briefly detain individuals without a warrant if they have reasonable, articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. This standard is lower than the probable cause required for an arrest, but it is still a meaningful barrier. An officer cannot detain someone based on hunches, intuitions, or feelings. There must be specific, objective facts that would lead a reasonable officer to suspect criminal activity. What objective facts did Trooper Blackwell have? Marcus was standing in a public parking lot taking photographs of a parked police vehicle. That was it. That was the entirety of the suspicious activity. And as I have explained, photography of police and police vehicles in public spaces is not criminal activity. It is constitutionally protected expression that courts have repeatedly affirmed. There is no law in Idaho that criminalizes photographing police officers or their vehicles. There is no statute that makes it illegal to document what appears through the window of a patrol car when that car is parked in a public area, visible to anyone walking by. The trooper may have been annoyed by what Marcus was doing. He may have felt that his privacy was being invaded, but his feelings do not create legal authority for a detention. This brings us to a concept that Trooper Blackwell himself raised during the encounter, the plain view doctrine. This legal principle, established through decades of Supreme Court decisions, holds that police officers do not violate the Fourth Amendment when they observe things that are in plain view from a lawful vantage point. A 1983 case called Texas v. Brown affirmed that officers could look into automobile interiors through windows and even seize contraband observed in plain view because there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in objects that can be seen by any passerby. The irony here is almost too perfect. Police across America rely on the plain view doctrine every day to justify looking into citizens' vehicles, to justify searches based on things observed through windows, to justify seizures of items that were never concealed. Yet, when a citizen applied the exact same principle to a police vehicle, when Marcus photographed what was visible through the trooper's window from a public parking lot, he was treated as if he had committed some kind of violation. This is the double standard that started the entire sequence of events, and that continued throughout the encounter. Trooper Blackwell expected to be held to a different standard than ordinary citizens. He expected that his traffic violations would go unnoticed and undocumented. He expected that his vehicle would be shielded from photography in ways that our vehicles are not. He expected that his badge would grant him immunity from the accountability that the Constitution demands. This expectation of special treatment is not unique to Trooper Blackwell. It is endemic in law enforcement culture across the country. Officers who would write tickets for the exact same traffic violations they commit routinely. Departments that invoke privacy concerns when citizens film their activities while simultaneously operating surveillance programs that monitor the public without consent. A legal system that gives the benefit of the doubt to officer testimony while treating citizen accounts with skepticism. None of this is to suggest that all police officers behave this way. The contrast between Trooper Blackwell and Sergeant Carver makes precisely this point. Sergeant Carver demonstrated what professional constitutional policing looks like. He recognized Marcus's rights. He documented what was happening. He offered to help create a record. He treated Marcus with the basic dignity that every citizen deserves. If you have made it this far into this video, I want to express my appreciation. These are not easy stories to tell or to hear. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power operates in our society and about the gaps between the rights we theoretically possess and the rights we can actually exercise. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not already, and share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding these issues more deeply. There is a broader significance to what happened to Marcus that extends far beyond his individual experience. Every time an officer retaliates against a citizen for exercising First Amendment rights, it sends a message to everyone else in the community. That message is simple. If you dare to document or criticize us, you will pay a price. The detention may be brief. The search may find nothing. You may not be arrested, but you will be humiliated. You will be threatened. You will be reminded of who holds the power. This chilling effect on constitutional rights is precisely what the First Amendment was designed to prevent. The framers of the Constitution understood that government power, left unchecked, would naturally expand to suppress criticism and dissent. They understood that the freedom to speak, to publish, to document, to petition for redress of grievances was essential to maintaining a free society. They wrote these protections into the fundamental law of the land, specifically because they knew that powerful interests would always seek to silence those who challenged them. When Trooper Blackwell detained Marcus, he was not just violating one person's rights. He was attacking the broader principle that citizens have the right to hold government accountable. He was saying, through his actions, that the Constitution's guarantees can be suspended whenever an officer feels disrespected or inconvenienced. He was demonstrating that the badge grants a kind of sovereignty that ordinary citizens cannot challenge. But here is what officers like Trooper Blackwell often fail to understand. The Constitution is not a suggestion. The rights it guarantees are not privileges that government grants and can withdraw at its pleasure. They are limitations on government power that exist precisely because of the tendency of those in authority to abuse that authority when they are not constrained. The encounter between Marcus and Trooper Blackwell also reveals something important about the concept of the so-called bad apple in law enforcement. This metaphor is often invoked to suggest that police misconduct is the work of isolated individuals who do not represent the institution as a whole. But the bad apple theory fails to account for the institutional factors that allow bad apples to continue operating. Consider the circumstances of this case. Trooper Blackwell conducted this detention in broad view of the Ashford Police Department building. He made his threats within earshot of a local officer who emerged to investigate. He apparently felt no concern that his behavior might result in consequences. He operated with the impunity of someone who believed, with good reason, that his colleagues and his institution would protect him. The real question raised by cases like this is not whether there are bad apples in law enforcement. Of course there are. Every large institution has members who abuse their authority. The question is, what happens when those bad apples are identified? Do institutions hold them accountable? Do supervisors take complaints seriously? Do fellow officers speak up when they witness misconduct? Or do institutional forces protect wrongdoers and punish those who expose them? Sergeant Carver's actions provide a glimmer of hope in this regard. He made the choice to document what was happening rather than to look the other way. He activated his body camera knowing that it would create a record of his colleagues' behavior. He offered to help Marcus access that record for the purpose of seeking accountability. These are not the actions of someone who prioritizes institutional solidarity over constitutional rights, but one good officer is not enough to counterbalance a system that too often shields misconduct from consequences. The fact that Marcus filed a complaint and received no clear resolution speaks to the structural problems that allow bad actors to continue operating. The lack of transparency in complaint investigations, the absence of civilian oversight in many jurisdictions, the qualified immunity that protects officers from personal liability for constitutional violations. These systemic factors create an environment where misconduct can flourish. What are we as citizens to do in the face of these realities? I would suggest that there are several responses that can make a difference over time. First, we must continue to document our interactions with police whenever possible. The technology in our pockets gives us the ability to create records that cannot be disputed or dismissed. Use that technology. Know your rights regarding when and how you can record. Second, we must continue to file complaints even when we doubt that they will be taken seriously. Every complaint creates a paper trail. Every complaint adds to an officer's personnel file. Even if individual complaints do not result in discipline, patterns of complaints can eventually trigger reviews and consequences. Third, we must support organizations and movements that work for police reform. There are groups across this country fighting for civilian oversight boards, for the elimination of qualified immunity, for increased transparency in disciplinary proceedings. These fights happen at the local, state, and federal levels, and they need engaged citizens to succeed. Fourth, we must share stories like Marcus's with our friends, families, and communities. Awareness is the first step toward change. Many people go through their lives without ever having their rights violated by police. They may find it difficult to believe that such violations occur regularly. Stories with video evidence change minds. They make the problem visible in ways that statistics alone cannot accomplish. Finally, we must maintain a balanced perspective that recognizes both the reality of police misconduct and the existence of officers who do their jobs with professionalism and integrity. The goal is not to demonize all police officers. The goal is to create systems that identify and remove those who abuse their authority while supporting those who serve honorably. Sergeant Carver and Trooper Blackwell wore similar uniforms and carried similar badges, but their conduct in this situation could not have been more different. As I bring this story to a close, I want to return to Marcus and the question of what this encounter meant for him personally. He went home that evening after being searched and dismissed. He ate his dinner. He went to sleep. He woke up the next morning and went to work, because that is what working people do. The world does not stop turning because your rights were violated. Bills still need to be paid. Responsibilities still need to be met. But something had changed for Marcus. He had experienced firsthand the gap between constitutional promises and lived reality. He had learned that asserting his rights could result in retaliation rather than respect. He had discovered that the institutions charged with upholding the law were capable of violating it with impunity. This kind of encounter changes people. It creates a wariness toward authority that never entirely goes away. It makes you second-guess your instincts to document wrongdoing, knowing what the consequences might be. It leaves you with a lingering sense of injustice that sits in your chest, especially when accountability never comes. But Marcus also experienced something else that evening. He experienced the solidarity of a fellow citizen in uniform who recognized what was happening and chose to document it. He experienced the knowledge that his dashcam had captured evidence that could not be denied. He experienced the decision to file a complaint, to demand accountability, to refuse to let the matter simply fade away. These are the small acts of resistance that add up over time. Each person who documents misconduct, who files a complaint, who shares their story, contributes to a growing awareness that can eventually produce change. The arc of justice is long, as the saying goes, and it does not bend on its own. It bends because people grab hold of it and pull. For those watching this video who have never had their rights violated by police, I hope this story has given you a window into what that experience is like. I hope it has made you more aware of the constitutional principles at stake and more attuned to the ways those principles can be violated. And I hope it has given you some tools for understanding and responding if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. For those watching who have had experiences like Marcus's, I hope this story has validated what you went through. I hope it has shown you that you are not alone, that these patterns of conduct exist across the country, and that there are people fighting to change them. Your experiences matter, your stories matter, your willingness to speak up and seek accountability matters. The constitutional rights that the founders enshrined in our basic law are not self-executing. They depend on citizens who are willing to exercise them, on lawyers who are willing to defend them, on courts that are willing to enforce them, and on journalists and storytellers who are willing to illuminate what happens when they are violated. We began this story with Marcus pulling up to a stoplight beside a state trooper, watching minor traffic violations, and making a fateful decision to document what he had seen. We followed him through a detention that violated the Fourth Amendment, witnessed his resilience in the face of harassment, and observed the contrasting behavior of two officers who made very different choices. What lessons can we draw from this entire sequence of events? First, the constitutional rights are fragile. They exist on paper, but their protection depends on the willingness of government officials to respect them. When those officials choose instead to violate them, citizens bear the immediate costs. Second, that documentation is power. Marcus's dash cam and Sergeant Carver's body camera transform this from a he said situation into a matter of recorded fact. Technology has given ordinary citizens tools for accountability that were unimaginable a generation ago. Use them. Third, that not all police officers are the same. Trooper Blackwell abused his authority. Sergeant Carver documented that abuse. The existence of good officers does not excuse the bad ones, but it does suggest that reform is possible because reform has allies within law enforcement itself. Fourth, that the fight for accountability is long and often frustrating. Marcus filed his complaint and waited. He did not receive swift justice or immediate vindication. The system moves slowly, and it often protects its own. But the fight matters, even when victories are slow in coming. Fifth, and finally, that our rights do not end where someone else's fear or discomfort begins. Trooper Blackwell was uncomfortable being photographed. He was afraid, perhaps, of what documentation might reveal about his conduct. But his discomfort did not give him the authority to detain, search, and harass a citizen engaged in protected activity. Freedom means tolerating things that make us uncomfortable. It means accepting that others have rights, even when the exercise of those rights feels threatening. This is a lesson that all of us, police and citizens alike, must constantly relearn. Thank you for joining me through this entire story. If you found value in this analysis, please take a moment to subscribe and to share this video with others who might benefit from it. The conversations we have in spaces like this matter. They shape how we understand our rights and how we collectively demand that those rights be respected. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have taken those photographs? Would you have filed that complaint? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These questions do not have easy answers, but wrestling with them helps all of us become more thoughtful citizens. Until next time, remember, the Constitution is not just a document in a museum. It is a living set of promises that we must defend every single day. Stand up for your rights, document what you see, demand accountability from those who serve. The future of our freedoms depends on it.